Thank you again for joining us for Benefits of Infill Development. At this point, I will turn the webinar over to Christina Adeshakan, Housing Specialist with the Housing Assistance Council, who would do the introductions as well as the overview for our webinar today. Christina?
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Benefits of Infill Development. Infill development is the process of developing vacant or underused parcels within existing cities or towns that are already largely developed. Most communities have significant vacant land within city limits, which for various reasons get passed over in the normal course of site selection. Ideally, infill development involves more than the piecemeal development of individual lots. This webinar is intended to provide essential information on the benefit of utilizing infill lots for housing development. We have two great speakers presenting benefits of infill development this afternoon. Our first speaker is Scott Reynolds. Scott is the Executive Director of Housing Development Alliance, HDA. He has worked in rehabilitation and construction of affordable housing in Eastern Kentucky since 1992. Under his leadership, the Housing Development Alliance has grown from a staff of 1 to a staff of 30. Since 1996, HDA has completed over 2,900 homeownership units, over 750 repairs for low-income homeowners, and developed 36 rental units. In 2019, HDA launched Hope Building, a program to provide paid on-the-job training to people in recovery through building houses for moderate income buyers. Scott also serves as the Executive Director of Redbird Financial Alternatives, Inc., a CDFI created by the Housing Development Alliance to provide an alternative to high-cost and or predatory consumer lenders. Redbird has originated over $400,000 in fair and equitable loans. Scott serves on the board of Federation of Appalachian Housing Enterprises and the National Rural Housing Coalition, Appalachian Impact Fund, Perry County Community Foundation, Invest Appalachia, and the East Kentucky Youth Soccer Association. Scott has a Master of Divinity from Candler School of Theology of Emory University. Our second presenter this afternoon is Tom Collishaw. Tom is the President and CEO of Self-Help Enterprises, a multifaceted housing and community development nonprofit serving the San Joaquin Valley of California since 1996. The oldest and the largest self-help housing organization in the country, Self-Help Enterprises was a pioneer in the development of sweat equity housing for rural low-income people. Since its beginning in 1996, the nonprofit organization has assisted 6,300 families in construction of their own homes, rehabilitated another 6,600 homes, and developed over 1,450 units of affordable rental housing, which it owns and operates. Tom is routinely sought out for input on legislative matters related to housing at both the state and national levels. He serves on the board of Housing California, California Coalition for Rural Housing, National Rural Housing Coalition, National Farm Worker Housing Directors Association, and is the current president of the National Rural Self-Help Housing Association. Tom is a graduate of Colgate University and the Achieving Excellence in Community Development program at Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Recently, Self-Help Enterprises was named a top 50 affordable housing developer and a California nonprofit organization of the year. Help me to welcome our presenters this afternoon. We're so fortunate to have all of them available for this webinar. Thank you, Tom and Scott.
Thanks, Christine, for having us. I'm really excited to be here and talk about Infill. So a little bit of context about the Housing Development Alliance. We are a 27-year-old nonprofit with a mission to use the power of housing to transform lives and build a brighter future for our community. We serve 4 counties in Southeast Kentucky, and as you mentioned, we've done 300 and some odd homes, repaired over 800, and developed about 35 rental units. A little more context about where we work. We're in the corner of Southeast Kentucky. We're located in the heart of the coal fields, some of the poorest counties in the nation. They're all persistent poverty counties and all deemed to be distressed by the ARC. If you're not real good on your East Coast geography, I've got that ARC map there, and that right in the center of the big blob of red of distressed is where we work. A little more about context of who we are. We are a mountain area, and so flat land is hard to come by, buildable land is hard to come by, which is one reason I think we've done as many infill units as we have, which is about 70 to date. So when I talk about landfill, I think about kind of the classic infill, which is the vacant lot picture there, where you've got a community, you got houses, and there's just a lot that's not been built on. And that's about a quarter of our infill. Most of our infill actually is, sometimes called land recycling, that sort of thing, where you're looking at a dilapidated vacant structure that has to be demolished, like the one that's pictured here. And I think it's important it needs to be vacant and it needs to be demolished if you're saving the unit or you're dealing with residents and you're kind of really getting into, redevelopment or something. So when we talk about infill, we're talking about those two things. About half the time with the vacant structure, it's actually collapsed or burned down. And so we're really just dealing with a foundation. I thought I'd start with a few of kind of suggestions about things to be on the watch out for, some challenges and cautions. The first one I'd probably share is to think about the fact that sometimes land is vacant for a reason. It could have environmental issues, and that's especially true if it has any kind of past commercial use. Sometimes you lack a legal right of access. We've seen lots that have been landlocked by a small 2 or 3 foot wide strip of land that never got transferred properly or such. Sometimes it's just unsuitable or unstable soils, or in our area, it may be solid rock. And so building is difficult. We've seen issues with easements. Sometimes the nice piece of land, half of it is claimed in a road easement or maybe a utility easement. Of course, in rural America, a lot of times those easements aren't really recorded. We encountered a piece of property that had 2 main sewer lines running through where we wanted to build the house, and nothing was recorded, but when we started asking around, we found out about them. Title issues are another big issue, and then what I call the hidden surprises, which is kind of what we got into with these pictures. The one before picture, it was a really overgrown lot, lots of kudzu, if you know what that is, if you're from the East Coast. And we thought we really understood what we were buying, but when we got in there, actually, after we bought it and did the demolition, we discovered 2 different retaining walls and a lot more slope on the lot than we ever imagined, which is why we landed up with the really high foundation on that house. All of which is to say, if you're going to do infill, just make sure you do your due diligence about the property so that you don't have, unfortunate, unexpected things. A few more challenges and cautions. A lot of times I think we think that because you're not running water or having to build roads, it's going to be cheaper. That's not always the case. The lot in this picture I paid $1 for, but there was a 15-foot difference in the front corner and the back corner. So we put a $19,000 foundation. So was the land really cheaper? Scale is really hard unless you are doing larger tracts. Because if you're buying individual tracts, whereas if you're doing a 10-unit subdivision, that's 1 transaction. If you're buying 10 individual lots, that's 10 transactions. So there's a lot more work. Our experience with NIMBY on infill, that it tends to be a little more intense because you are literally building in somebody's backyard. So it can be a little more amped up. It also tends to last longer. The particular house that's shown here, we built one right next door, and the buyer loved tacky yard art, and I heard about tacky yard art and complaints from the neighbors for a good 5 years. And then, of course, sometimes zoning can be an issue. Sometimes even when the property is zoned correctly, there can be challenges with the setbacks. They want a 25-foot setback in the front and a 15 in the back and 10 on each side. And before you know it, there's not enough room to build a house. Or you may run into odd requirements. The communities we work in typically don't have, or they have a lot of own street parking. And one of the communities decided that every new house that's built has to have 2 parking spaces. And that's really hard on sloping land. Or another one we run into is the requirement to have sidewalks. So we've actually poured sidewalks that end into the neighbor's fence because nobody else has sidewalks. And those are just things that can add some cost. Obviously, if you're working in a neighborhood, you're going to have an impact on that neighborhood. And so some of the questions you want to ask is the vacant land important to the neighborhood? Is it where the kids play soccer or baseball? Is it are they using it as a garden? And just, make sure and that doesn't mean you can't work with it, but you may need to make some accommodations. Obviously, construction can be noisy and messy and even dangerous. And if you're right in the middle of a neighborhood, that's to be concerned. The picture here, would make a great place to jump a BMX bike. And somebody could get hurt doing that. And so you can see we put a big 6-foot fence around that construction zone. Does the housing fit the neighborhood? Is it going to enhance it? Is it going to be a detraction? And then I think a really thorny issue is, will the new development kind of result in pricing people out? We all want to improve neighborhoods, but at the same time, I don't think we want to be the reason why people can no longer afford to live where they've lived for a long time. And that's really tricky. And then there's construction challenges associated with infill. Typically, we run into very small lots, and so there's no place to store materials. And so you have to, can you get daily deliveries from the lumber yard? Oftentimes, you have really narrow streets and maybe on-street parking, and you're trying to get a big concrete truck in there, and that can be challenging. School traffic can be an absolute nightmare. We worked close to school, and there was an hour in the morning and an hour in the afternoon that you just couldn't get to the site, or couldn't leave the site for that matter. Utilities are present, but are they on the right side of the street? You don't want to be the person that has to dig up the road to get your sewer in. Are they adequate, or are they dated? We see a lot of clay pipes in the old sewers, and that makes tying in difficult and challenging. Unlike out in the rural areas where stormwater may not be a big issue, in the city it typically is. And so where are you getting that? And where are you taking your stormwater away from your property, making sure you're not dumping it on the neighbor? And as this picture shows, it can require some special designs. This particular house is all the living space is upstairs. It's a story and a half, and with the kind of the garage in the basement area. And you can see we had to pull the front of the garage back to allow a second parking space off-road. And, that's not a design you're going to find typically in a catalog. So you're going to have to do some custom designs. So we spent a lot of time talking about kind of challenges. Let's talk about why you want to do it, because you really do. And I think they start with location. It's often the only way to build in a city. They don't make any more land or a certain neighborhood. And if you want to build there, you're going to have to figure out how to do infill. It puts the housing close to jobs and shopping and schools and amenities like park and recreation opportunities. And people just want to live there. And so it's, again, if you're going to work in a city, you're going to end up or a town, you're going to end up doing infill. There's some environmental advantages. You're not utilizing any kind of prime farmland or undisturbed land, or in our case, we're not having to clear some wooded land, because typically it's already been disturbed at least somewhat as the city was developed. And of course, that proximity that the people like also means less travel, and so less carbon footprint. So that's a good thing. There can be cost savings because, again, unlike building a subdivision where you're having to maybe build a new road or extend water and sewer, you typically wouldn't do that or wouldn't do as much of that. For us, sewer is really only available within the towns. And if you have sewer, you don't have to have a septic system, so you can have a higher density and spread the land cost out over more units. So there's some cost savings. And it can be a lot quicker, and we all know time is money. So if you're not having to take a subdivision plan to a zoning committee or a county commission or whatever and get it approved, it can be a quicker way to develop housing and some cost savings associated with that. Obviously, it can improve a neighborhood. There was a fascinating study done in Philadelphia. They went out and did a mental health survey of several neighborhoods, and then they picked certain neighborhoods and they cleaned up the vacant lots. They didn't do anything with them. They just made them, they got rid of the trash, planted some grass, and then they came back and did a mental health survey, and they found significant decreases in feelings of depression and worthlessness just by cleaning up the lots. And so if you're taking a vacant lots or rundown houses and turning them into the housing, that will improve the neighborhood and can actually help folks. And we've seen a lot of anecdotal evidence of when we go into a neighborhood and do some infill, the neighbors start sprucing up their property, and it really improves the whole neighborhood. And local governments typically really like infill. Again, it's the only way they're going to get more housing built. And of course, housing equals tax base, housing equals students in your schools. And so because they like it, that can result in a lot of flexibility sometimes with those obstacles like zonings and setbacks. And if you involve your local governments, you can also sometimes get access to new funding. We've been able to just this year get our first CDBG project for some infill housing. So last, I want to talk a little bit about some lessons learned. This was our first multi-lot infill. These are homeownership units, but we bought the tract kind of outlined in the satellite photograph there in blue. And we had anticipated building 6 houses there, but we didn't really do a great job communicating with our local government on the front end. And so we were in for some surprises. You see the little red area that was X'd out. We had originally thought we'd bring a road in and connect the 2 roads there. But apparently that was tied up in a property dispute that everybody but us knew about. And the city wasn't going to touch that, and they weren't willing to, use any power of eminent domain or anything to help us with that road. So then we had to go look. As you can tell from the photograph, it's steep. It's actually much steeper than it looks in that picture. So we had to do this road down the hill to get to the bottom, and the city suddenly wanted a 20-foot wide road, which is much wider than any other road in the neighborhood, and they wanted sidewalks. None of the roads in the neighborhood have sidewalks. And so suddenly, we're have a lot more costs than we anticipated. And then we got into setbacks, and lo and behold, when, the 2 lots I kind of outlined there in green, we didn't get to build on because by the time we did the wide road, the off-street parking, the setbacks that they required, we couldn't squeeze those houses in there and meet all the requirements. And then kind of the icing on the cake was the day we did the final inspection on the final unit. The building inspector asked us when we were going to build the other 2. And it turns out that there was a process we could have gone through had we really communicated and built on those 2 lots. But by that point, it was already too late because they've already been deeded to other people. So if you're doing infill, talk to your government early, communicate with them. And hopefully you can avoid that kind of challenges. The next kind of multi-unit tract we did, we involved this old school building. It's a beautiful building. It had gone about 15 years too long without a roof to be saved. But this was, to me, being transparent on this project was really important. The neighbors were very, very concerned. We had really 2 challenges. One is everybody wanted to save the gorgeous old building. And then they were concerned about what was going to happen to their neighborhood. And so in terms of being transparent, they kept asking, can't the building be saved? And we were honest. Yeah, it could be saved, but it's going to cost over $1 million. And when we had that conversation, And they realized that nobody really had that kind of money to put into that building, and then there really wasn't a good use to justify that kind of money. They became kind of okay with, and when they understood the houses and the quality we were going to build and that it was going to be home ownership, they were very against rental in that area. And so it all kind of worked out, but it really took us being, communicating with the neighbors and being very transparent. In terms of being sensitive, if you can see it on your screen, above the door, there's a little gable area, and there's a stone in there that was chiseled out the words Hazard High School, because that was the original high school. And somewhere along the line, we picked up that was really important to that community. And we paid a contractor to come in and save that. And we gave it to the school, and they made the new high school, and they made a little memorial to the old high school. And it just went a long way to connecting with the community. And then in terms of being bold, this was a really big project for us, tearing down that huge building. This is actually the site that I said was a good BMX track. And we had to bring in 450 truckloads of dirt. It was way more than anything we had done. And it took, we had to step out, but it worked out really well. And our last lesson from this is make it pretty. So on the left, you see the red brick home that's got a lot of charm. I mean, and there's no way we could have ever built anything like that. But it was a really nice neighborhood. So we kind of went the extra mile in our design. We've got a little craftsman-esque house. All of the houses in the neighborhood had vinyl porch rails and concrete porches and some hip roofs and concrete board siding, some things we don't normally do, but we went that extra mile. And it really helped with the neighborhood, and it really won the local government over, which then led to our the last project I want to talk about, which is, really for us a huge project. This abandoned strip mall had been vacant for 15 years, and it was a real eyesore in the community. The city partnered with us and actually went and got a CDBG grant to buy that, demolish it, run water and sewer and a new road for us. You can see what the site looks like just a couple of days ago. And we pre-sold 9 of the 15 lots, and we hope to start construction in the next day or two, or next week or two. And so it's a much bigger project than, I would have ever thought we could do in Infill. But you just kind of, we were able to build up to it, and it's worked out really great. And so I'll turn it over to Tom now.
All right, as we transition over to Tom, I'd like to remind the audience that if you have questions for Scott, and also as you listen to Tom, if you have questions, to please enter them into the Q&A box that's on the right-hand side of your screen. And so I will quickly go ahead and turn it over to Tom.
Great, thank you. I think I gave Christina a little bit of wrong information, because Self-Help Enterprises, we've actually been around since 1965, not 1996, but close enough. We work in an 8-county area of the San Joaquin Valley of California, home to many farm workers and disadvantaged communities. It is an area, the 8-county area is about the size of West Virginia, so it's a large area as well. When I was first asked to do this, and we are known for both our single-family development. We do some infill single-family ownership development as well, but we also do a significant amount of rental housing units. So it was decided that I would focus on our multifamily infill development. And one thing just to add, and a lot of the things I say are going to be remarkably similar to what Scott shared, because the lessons learned are very similar, even though we're in California and he's in Kentucky. One thing to add on the single family side, we have recently gotten involved in accessory dwelling units for single family, sometimes referred to as granny flats. And there's a lot of interest in that in the state of California as a way to increase the density and create more affordable housing in existing neighborhoods. So I'm going to talk about our multifamily inventory. And when I thought about this, I didn't necessarily think about self-help enterprises being a substantial infill site developer, but I started to look at our inventory. We're up to 40 sites, about 1,836 units, and half of them are actually infill sites. And I'm going to define infill site as a contiguous, having contiguous development on 3 sides of a property that includes some new construction of units. This definition has actually become important to us in California because some of our main funding streams for financing these kinds of developments have defined infill lots differently and sometimes problematically. So we like a very simple definition of 3 sides of the properties are developed, and one of those 3 sides could be with a street. So I wanted to show this just because this was a first Gateway Village. This is in a community known as Modesto. It's a 25-year-old property now, but it was an infill project of 48 rental units. And actually there was a piece of this property that we developed into self-help homes as well. So there were 10 self-help units that are contiguous to this rental site. The density is about 10 units to the acre. So why do we love infill sites? Well, some of the things that Scott pointed out. It's a great chance to improve and reinvigorate neighborhoods that are existing. Oftentimes, the infrastructure, which is becoming increasingly expensive on greenfield development for us, is often already there, or at least some of it's already there. It can also be instrumental in really improving a neighborhood and improving the properties. You know, we occasionally worry about gentrification, but we don't generally see that trend in most of the places where we do infill development. So we don't see people being displaced because we're developing new properties. And we also think it can honor a neighborhood's character and build upon its existing traditions. And that's why we also really insist on, when we develop at least a concept plan, that's when we want to go meet the neighbors. And we want to meet them straight up and really talk to them about what our vision is and hear what their vision is for their neighborhood. Oftentimes, even the ones that come to those meetings that are really concerned about new development, you can actually listen to what their concerns are, and often your development is the answer to many of those concerns. And we find that we basically say, we're here to be a good neighbor. We become an instant advocate with you for the things that you're concerned about, whether it's police protection or the lack of, garbage pickup or the sewer problems or whatever. So those are all reasons we love infill sites. This is about a 12-year-old property in a place called Lamont. This is 44 units. It was on an infill site. And this is about 11 units per acre. So I'm just giving you a sense of the kind of things that we've built in infill sites. So why do infill sites exist? And Scott certainly alluded to this, but the reality is no market-driven developer has been able to make it work. We, at least in our area, our rural communities, we're not seeing them lose population the way some places in America, rural America, that's happening. So there is still an interest in developing, and if the local flipper can't make it work, there's usually a reason for that. There are also often infrastructure can be inadequate, and it could sometimes just be that the neighborhood itself is depressed and has seen better days, or most of the units in the neighborhood are deteriorating. So that's why it's important to be skeptical, especially about those hidden surprises Scott mentioned, and particularly what is and is not already underground. This is a project that's less than 5 years old. It's actually an infill site in the city of Visalia. This is about 12 units to the acre. It's 36 units altogether. So these are just some examples of our infill development. So due diligence really is the most important part of the pre-development process on infill sites. And I just say, get yourself a good checklist. This is just a portion of one of the checklists that we use, but it's essential that you get one that's relevant to your area. Just a few to point out that's on this list. Existing improvements, important to know what's there, what's not there. I apologize, I have a phone call that I won't answer. Phase 1 environmentals, we actually started doing phase 1 environmental reviews and just on any site that we were looking at, and it's just a cost that we build into pre-development because we found out the hard way that you can't really do without it. And the baseline is it gives you a history of the use of the property and ownership and those kinds of things, and it can be essential. These days, the banks, if you're going to use a bank or any other lender or a federal program, you're going to need a phase 1 environmental anyway. Floodplain, whether something's in the floodplain, is obviously critical. Grading in general is really important. We've had scenarios where we've gone in, property looks good, only to find out that we have to do all kinds of infill and even retaining walls so that we could meet current code in the development that we were proposing. Are there nuisance issues? Are there noise or odors or something like that? Important to go out there and really walk the property. Existing sewer and water laterals. We've had a lot of situations where somebody said, oh yeah, those laterals are in the street, and then we've dug them up and found out that they weren't there, or they were not built to current code, or whatever the scenario might be. So it's really important to get to know the oldest person at the local public works department who may have a recollection of when that street went in and when that property was first created. Zoning is critical, as Scott said, and it's also important to know what you're going to have to do with new utilities that you put in. In our state, we often have to underground those utilities, and they can be that can be a significant cost. So just a few infill nightmares, and these are just from the last couple years. So this is work that's not for the faint of heart. We had one situation where the lots, as I mentioned, needed fill and retainage to meet new standard drainage standards and floodplain requirements, and that ended up being on a 40-unit project that ended up costing us probably about $100,000. Another situation we had was we didn't realize until we started to develop the site that suddenly the public works folks told us that there's an existing sewer flow problem and they really needed a lift station, which was about a $240,000 add to our project. I've mentioned having to underground major utility lines. We've run into that. And then we've also run into a scenario where we actually developed an infill site only to find out that there was an irrigation pipe that ran from a local irrigation district that ran on the back of the property that needs to be abandoned. And that was, we were already into development when we found that. So there are plenty of things that could go wrong, even when you have a good checklist and do as good a job as you possibly can with due diligence. So I'm going to end by kind of walking you through a recent multifamily development that we were involved with that we're quite proud of, and but it is a good sort of object lesson in what you can run into. This is in a community known as Lindsay, California. It's a small city of about 8,000 people. It is largely populated by farm workers. And as you can see, the site that I kind of circled in blue was basically an orange grove that was a remnant, and there's development all around it. To the right of this picture, you see a mobile home park. Hermosa Street, which is to the north, is really the main thoroughfare that comes into town. An elementary school you could see is right catty corner diagonally across the street. And the most significant shopping center of the community, including the main supermarket, is within easy walking distance. So we saw it as a great infill site in terms of providing amenities to folks who would live there. So we set about trying to figure out how we could develop this site. One other thing to mention is that there was not a historic building, but there was an old ranch farmhouse that had been built up that was actually quite beautiful, that was on the site. It was the single structure on the site, and it had a swimming pool and that kind of thing. And our initial intent was to try to preserve it, similar to what Scott dealt with that brick building. We were trying to figure out a way to make that the clubhouse, perhaps, and maybe the main office for our rental project. But we too ran into significant problems. It had asbestos. It was never built to code. A second story was added, and it turned out that it just was not feasible to save it. But we did talk to the neighbors about that, and we came up with a strategy to kind of honor it, which you'll see in a moment. So this is the result of our first phase of development. I've kind of flipped you around on this picture. Unfortunately, it's not looking in the same direction. So on the bottom of this picture, you're seeing that main drag that I mentioned, Hermosa. This was 50 units. Our first phase is completed and occupied. This is a project that's about 20 units per acre, so significantly more dense than we have done in the past. It's a tuck under parking product that gives you a sense there. There are 2-story units and eight plexes. Quite attractive, but definitely higher density than we've built in the past, and that's mostly because for us to compete for some of the funding that we want, it is important for us to build at higher densities these days. The challenges with this project were fairly significant. There were several. One is there was a well on the site that ironically was not just serving the use of the grower of the orange trees, but it was actually serving the folks next door at the mobile home park, which we didn't realize because we were abandoning this well. And suddenly they said, "Oh, we're going to be without water." So we had to maneuver through that scenario. Also in the phase 1 and then subsequently a phase 2 environmental review, there were some residual pesticides used on orange trees that had to be remediated. So we actually had to carefully pick the trees out and then excavate about 3 feet of dirt from right around the base of the trees. We had a traffic safety issue because the local school and the neighbors complained that it was dangerous to kids walking across Hermosa to the school. So we actually were able to get some additional funding to do a roundabout in the area and create a much safer intersection. But that did require us working with some neighbors to get some additional land to build the roundabout. And then I mentioned that we had the existing building and pool. So I did want to share this. This is the clubhouse or the community room feature that we have, and the pillars that are in the front of this building actually incorporated the actual pillars of the old farmhouse that had this wonderful veranda and front porch. And we also, on the interior of that building, did the same thing. And the locals and the historians locally really appreciated our doing that and trying to honor that tradition. And just quickly, the pictures here of the roundabout as it was in construction, and we had to get some additional land for that, but we were able to certainly beautify that area, create a much safer place for people. There's crosswalks at all four corners now, and you got the traffic calming effect, but also the traffic safety effect. And so that is Palm Terrace, and that wraps up my initial comments. Thank you.
All right, great, Tom. Thank you so much. What a wonderful presentation. Before we roll over into our Q&A portion of the webinar, I want to remind folks that if you have questions for both Tom and Scott, please enter them into the Q&A box that appears on the right-hand side of your screen. We've got just a few questions that have come in, and this last one I want to push up to the top because, Tom, you just talked about the ER process with the trees, and it really is applicable to Scott as well. And so wanted to ask, how difficult or expensive were the SHPO and ER clearance processes for each of you in terms of taking down the old high school for you, Scott, and then Tom with regard to addressing or mitigating the tree issue that you had there?
I'll go first.
Tom or Scott, either one of you go first.
This is Tom. It cost us about $125,000 to do that remediation, but it was something we were able to absorb within our budget.
Yeah, in our project, in the old school, the State Historic Society didn't want us to demolish it, and so we actually had to bring in a structural engineer. It wasn't terribly expensive because he didn't have to do a lot of work to verify that the building was not economically feasible to save. The 3 feet bulge in the back wall and the 2 trees growing out of the roof and a few other things, made that pretty easy. But it was still a couple of $1,000s on our end. And I'm trying to remember our it was a much smaller project, and so I think we were a couple of $1,000s in for the level of environmental clearance we had to do.
All right, great, thank you. So the next question is for, again, either of the two of you. Do you ever encounter jurisdictions that require unreasonable off-site improvements? And if so, how do you address those challenges?
Well, the short answer is yes, from Tom. And we do find that, especially when a local jurisdiction is a partner in the project, like bringing in home money or sometimes CDBG or something else, that often what comes with that is a pretty broad wish list from them. We had one infill property, it was much smaller than the one I showed you there in Lindsay, where the city just felt like they could ask for everything, including a trash enclosure and street improvements, that we kept saying, you wouldn't ask anybody else to do this. And they basically agreed that, well, we're investing in it with our resources and we get to ask for more. So you do run into that. And sometimes you just got to figure out where you can draw the line and tell them, I'll do this, but we can't go that far.
That's funny, Tom, because that's exactly our experience, that we get asked to do things that no other developer or builder really in the community is asked to do. And oftentimes the city's not actually even bringing any money to the table. They just know that we have federal money, and through home or a SHOP program or something, and they just think that's an unlimited supply. So I do think, being reasonable, but also, pushing back and just saying we can't afford to do it. And it's always good to have those conversations
It sounds as though Scott may have dropped off unexpectedly. Let's see, let's give him 1 second because
I'm pretty sure Scott was about to say what I would agree with, and that is to have those conversations early and not don't put them off until later, and encourage everybody involved to make their call and their last call on permitting and what the requirements are going to be before you start construction, if you possibly can.
That is exactly what I was going to say, Tom. I got cut off. I'm back.
Scott is a magician today. No, we can hear you fine. Thank you so much, Scott. Scott, I'm glad you're back. You're back in just enough time. Want to come right back to you with a question from John out at Pathfinder. He wants to know, what sources of funds did you use, and did you sell homes to anyone or just those who met income requirements? Can you hear me, Scott? Can everyone hear me?
I can.
All right. So going to finish out the question, and hopefully Scott will be able to hear me. So
did we lose folks?
Scott, well, we can hear you, Scott. Can you hear us? All right. Going to finish out the question, and hopefully Scott will be able to hear me. What sources of funds, and did you sell to anyone or just those that met income requirements, and how much appraisal gap did you experience? We're going to hope that Scott's magic works and he's able to hear us. If not, we will move on to the next questions. We've just got a few more here. All right. I don't think that Scott's audio is working properly, so we will move on to the next question. So Tom, can you answer the next question? Does NIMBY opposition tend to be more or less pronounced with infill development?
You know, I was intrigued listening to Scott's presentation because he's absolutely right that the infill sites do create a more visceral initial reaction, because these are people who already live there. It's something that they've become accustomed to in their neighborhood, this infill lot. Sometimes it's seconded as an overgrown local park. But I do find
I'm hearing
that,
Tom now. I just couldn't hear Shantaria at all for whatever reason.
Okay.
What?
That's great, Scott. But I would say that overall, often you can turn an infill site into an opportunity to be a good neighbor. And again, if you approach them with, this is what we can do to improve the neighborhood, not just this lot, but improve the neighborhood, it can often be a winning formula.
Great. Thank you, Tom. I am actually going to throw back to Scott really quick to see if he can address John's question. If not, we will send Scott the question offline. But Scott, the question from John was, what sources of funds did you use, and how did you sell did you sell the homes to anyone or just those who met income requirements, and how much appraisal gap did you experience? All right. Good old technology. We will continue to roll on. John wanted to just let you know that we will send that question to Scott to connect the two of you. And so hopefully shortly Scott will be back with you with an answer to that. But let's go ahead and proceed with the next couple of questions. And the question is, how do you know if the proposed project is a good fit for the existing neighborhood?
I think that comes with some degree of due diligence with both the local city leaders, with who you meet in the neighborhood, and one way or the other, we have good experience in building in neighborhoods, and pictures and offering to take people by other developments you've done, I think are all an important part of the initial process, because usually people might have a vision in their head of what something's going to look like, but it's often way off. And so just trying to demystify what it's going to look and feel like, and do the best you can with renderings from your architects, or you know, samples from existing projects that you've been involved with, I think go a long way.
Great. Thank you, Tom. I am actually going to try and go back to Scott to see if Scott can actually hear us now. I don't want to exclude him from this conversation. Scott, can you hear us?
I can hear you on the phone.
All right, perfect, perfect. So, Scott, want to quickly jump back to a question that John had out at Pathfinder Services while we have you able to connect. He wanted to know, what funds did you use, and did you sell homes to anyone or just those that met income requirements, and how much, if any, appraisal gap did you experience?
So, John, we used kind of every bit of money we could find. For the big, the 6 units we did around the school building, the big brick building, we actually had a little bit of RHED money that for a project that was to explore how to do infill. So that was about $100,000 of development subsidy for that project. And then beyond that, we used home, shop, we financed them with USDA, some local state money, anything we could find. Taking off the $100,000 of RHED that kind of helped develop the site, we probably still had about a $25,000 to $30,000 per unit development gap, which actually is kind of our typical, that's what we deal with pretty much every day. And the homes were sold to folks who qualified for the USDA and SHOP program, so at or below 80%.
Great, great, thank you. And so, Scott, I'm going to stay with you really quick to perhaps have you also address the question that Tom just responded to. How do you know if the proposed project is a good fit for the existing neighborhood?
Yeah, I'll try to answer that. I was struggling a little bit with hearing Tom, and I think we're all on the kind of same page, but I think it really is about just getting out and meeting the neighbors and see what they're concerned with, and really becoming a partner with them. Because like Tom said, a lot of times what they're really concerned about are the same things that you're going to want. Like your residents are going to want their trash picked up. They're going to want a safe way to get in and out of the property and all. And that tends to really, that open communication really does tend to smooth a lot of rough edges and challenges. Of course, that's harder if you're doing kind of one-off, a lot here, a lot there. But you do what you can.
Great, great, thank you. And so we are almost right at the hour. We have one question remaining, and so I want to pose the question to both of you, and it's a two-part question. So the first part is, if presented with infill or developing a new subdivision, which would you select? And then the second part is, which would you recommend to a new or inexperienced development agency, and why? So let's start with Tom first, and then we'll go to Scott to complete it.
Yeah, I would always prefer infill sites because there's so many things that are more efficient about it, and you could do so much more with transportation and reducing greenhouse gases and all those good things. However, I think I'd tell a new developer to do greenfield development first because it just tends to be cleaner.
Perfect. Thank you. Scott, do you want to go ahead and address the question, please?
Yeah, and once again, Tom and I are really on the same page. I think all things being equal, infill is always a better option. It is a little more complicated, and so I do think Actually, if I was a new developer, if there was any way to buy lots that already exist, that's where I would start. I guess that's not really development, but if you were trying to break into affordable housing, to see if there were any lots you could develop before you try to, and get used to kind of building the house and then move on to the next challenge of the land.
Great, great. Thank you. We've got one additional question and one final minute remaining. And so I'm going to ask the question and hopefully we'll get through it. How do you find infill sites? How do you go about finding them?
We work. Oh, go ahead. Go, Scott.
No, go ahead, Tom.
No, we work with a variety of realtors, but also it's often going to cities and saying, because they tend to inventory these things, at least in California, because they have to have housing plans. So usually there's a map somewhere and we could sit down with somebody at a city or a county to talk about it.
Yeah, we'd have to hunt them ourselves and literally drive around neighborhoods. And but now that the cities have understood what it can do for them, they're actually bringing us properties now.
Perfect. Great. Thank you both, Tom and Scott, so much for the wealth of information that you've shared today. Thanks to the audience and those of you that hung in with us through our technical challenges. We certainly appreciate it. As we close out the webinar here today, I want to ask you to please be on the lookout for a survey following the webinar. We ask that you take a quick moment to fill it out. That is the way that you let us know if we are bringing the most relevant content to you based on your programs and services. And so with that said, I'd like to again thank both of our presenters, Scott McReynolds and Tom Collishaw. Their contact information is being displayed on the screen. And also thank you all for joining us today and hope you have a great rest of your afternoon. Goodbye.